Welcome to the new weekly duck migration forecast. I'm Dr. Mike Schumer, and many of you have probably followed my weekly duck migration forecast in the past, which was basically PDFs that you had to follow through. So I decided this year to move on and make a YouTube channel, call it a blog, whatever you like. These will occur weekly from next week until the end of January, and will be 7-day forecasts of migration, just like they were previously. So this is episode 1, the 2020-2021 predictions, or the predictions on long-term weather and migration patterns for the coming waterfowl hunting season for folks. I'll go through the information from climatologists and global climate models and such that I use to make these. It's a relatively difficult process to make seasonal forecasts at the length of 4 months or so. So at the end of November, I'll come out with another episode, which will be the later season predictions, which will be more reliable for December and January for the folks farther south. But a lot of this season looks like it's setting up very much like the season in 2016. Global weather patterns are very, very similar to 2016. So I'll go through what we use to make predictions about duck migration, and largely this is dabbling ducks, and for the Mississippi and Atlantic Flyway, and then talk about those longer term forecasts and climate models that I use, and then get into what the predictions are for the 2020-2021 season. The new format for this season will have weekly videos. You should subscribe to this YouTube channel to get these weekly updates by social media. You can email me your questions. I have a Gmail account here, weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. I will cover those at the beginning of each episode. I always get a lot of different types of questions regarding duck migration, factors that affect duck migration, questions about my predictions, questions about the 7-day forecast, questions about how different species migrate differently. And so I will work through those questions best I can. There's directions here on how to subscribe to the channel. You just go to YouTube, you sign in to YouTube in general. And when you want to subscribe, and it should be right below the video here, you just click the subscribe button, and that helps you stay up to date on duck migration. You don't have to work your way back to the channel specifically. If you subscribe, it will show right up in your YouTube account, and you'll be able to have it right away. So one of the questions I get is why this duck migration forecast relative to others. First of all, it's based on years of publicly available research about what makes ducks migrate. And there's a lot of this. Some of it I have published with colleagues. Some of it other colleagues have published that I've helped. There's mounds of data on duck migration patterns that we've used to understand what causes ducks to move south and at what time. And there's a lot of collaboration with leading climatologists that I've done to help predict seasonal weather and that influence on migration. And I guess to some people this matters. To me, it does a lot. I feel like some of what I bring forth is reputable. This stuff's brought to your fingertips weekly by a duck hunter. I hunt quite a bit, not as much as I'd like, because I'm in the office lots of times crunching numbers and doing waterfowl research on duck migration, as well as other waterfowl and wetlands topics. And the difference too is it's actually a 7-day forecast. Other duck migration pages tell you where the ducks are or have been. The weekly duck migration forecast that I produce tells you when and where dabbling ducks are likely to be migrating. So it tells you ahead of time what days might be the best days for you to go. We have very limited schedules nowadays. Kids playing sports, very active families, very busy work schedules. And this helps folks hopefully maximize their best potential days to be out duck hunting. So the area I cover with the duck migration forecast is the Mississippi and Atlantic Flyways. I always get asked about the Central Flyway. We are doing some work with duck migration in the near future. For the Central Flyway, I would say there's application to the Central Flyway. We just haven't developed the migration models that predict for that part of the world yet. So I'm a little apprehensive to say much about what's going to happen in the Central Flyway. But I think you could use a lot of the Mississippi Flyway predictions to be somewhat similar to what's going on in the Central, especially the eastern part of the Central. The Pacific Flyway movements have not been really studied that well, or I have not specifically studied them with colleagues. And temperature and snow patterns really differ substantially in the Pacific from Eastern North America. Eastern North America, the snow patterns generally move from north to south. And the further west you go, they get a little screwy because they're affected largely by elevation and then oceanic winds and such, which are quite different. So Pacific Flyway is something I haven't touched yet because it's kind of a daunting task. So what do we mean by a weekly duck migration forecast? Well, the first thing we had to figure out, and I did this with colleagues years ago, and we've refined these, is what really causes ducks to migrate, right? You'd think there'd be a number out there. We think we know what that is, but there were no real numbers to be able to pull weather data in and say, okay, this is a day when ducks should really be migrating. So the first thing we did is develop these daily weather severity indices. So we grabbed a whole bunch of different weather variables, moon phases, sunspots. I mean, we tested just about everything. And what we came up with that affected duck migration the most, looking at available waterfowl count data from wildlife management areas and available nearby weather station data, we basically found that this type of thing that you'd think is, what really affects duck migration is how cold is it on that day, how many inches of snow are there, how many days in a row has it been below freezing, and how many days has there been measurable snow. And this really makes sense because the temperature affects the energy output by the ducks themselves, as well as the potential wetland icing. The numbers of days below freezing really have a cumulative effect on the energy output by these animals and wetland icing that may actually cause them to not have foods accessible. For those that field feed, how deep the snow is really matters, and then how many days in a row that snow's been on the ground matters as well for something like a mallard. They may be able to stick it out for a few days, but it's really how cold it is, how snowy it is, and how long it's been really cold and how long that snow's been on the ground. It affects their energy intake and it affects their energy output. So what do these look like in? So if you look at this, this is the rate of change in relative abundance, or are ducks increasing or decreasing on the y-axis? And then the weather severity gets increasingly worse from left to right. And this is the model for mallards. And what you can see is there's a lot of variability around it. A lot of these plots above, which are basically tell you that ducks are increasing in abundance. So we add those four variables together, we get a number that tells us whether we should be seeing an increasing abundance of ducks, or at some threshold, right, we should be seeing a decreasing number of mallards. Now, again, there is variation around this, so these models are not 100%. And we produce these daily weather severity indices for mallards, black ducks, pintails, gadwall, widgeon, shovelers, and green-winged teal for locations throughout eastern North America. As you can expect, these ducks have different tolerances to weather severity, which is based on how they feed. It's also based on their body size and where they tend to feed. So why follow these forecasts again, right? The science of duck migration is really not an opinion. It's a refinement of information as we go forward. Not right about this 100% of the time, but if you think about this way, if I'm right 75% of the time, but you alone have a 50-50 chance, then you should probably follow this page because the math says that your chances will improve by about 25% at minimum of picking a day to have a good hunt. So this basically just increases the likelihood that you're probably going to have a good hunt because it's going to forecast out into the future, and hopefully you'll have a day you can pick to go hunting. So how do I make long-term predictions? The seasonal predictions are different than the 7-day stuff that'll be coming here starting next week. I look at global temperatures, right? Global temperatures are increasing, which really can affect duck migration to southern latitudes. A lot of the delays in migration have probably to do with multiple things that folks have seen. But when wetlands are not frozen at northern and mid latitudes and it's not snowing, ducks really don't have to go anywhere. I look at regional temperatures. This is June 2020 to August 2020, which was one of the across the globe, was one of the hotter summers and growing seasons that we've had. North American temps are increasing, and that could affect duck migration to southern latitudes. We also look at weather in distant areas such as Siberia, because it can impact global climate systems and as such our winter weather in eastern North America. I'll talk about in a little bit here how snow cover in Siberia affects the polar vortex as well as ice cover in the Arctic because of how it creates high and low pressure systems which either lock cold air at the poles or allow them to pour down the flyways. I look at Arctic sea ice because the location and amount of Arctic sea ice influences pressure systems and snowfall globally. If we look at sea ice this year, Arctic sea ice this year in late September, it was near the record minimum of 2012. It was relatively similar to 2016 for quite a while and 2017. It's on an upswing now, but there's still large portions of the Arctic Ocean which have open water. This creates marine heat sinks, but it also creates the opportunity for moisture when those waters are open that can produce large snowfall over Siberia, which again can affect our global climate system and whether we see cold outbreaks into eastern North America. In general, Arctic sea ice extent is declining rapidly, and open sea ice leads in the Barents and Kara Seas have been linked to late winter polar disruptions or a greater likelihood of cold outbreaks in eastern North America. So what's that look like when we look at these locations? When I talk about the Barents and Kara Sea, they're located just north of Russia in the Arctic Circle. This is the 25 September sea ice. You see the orange is the median ice edge at this time of year, so we're well behind that median ice edge from 1981 to 2010. So that open water again creates a really warm, strong high pressure system. But if it is cold enough in that part of the world across the land, it also has open water that can produce snow over Siberia at that time. So one of the things we know from long-term seasonal forecasts, specifically a colleague of mine that I've published a couple papers with, Judah Cohen, he works at Atmospheric and Environmental Research in Boston, is that the advance of snow cover in Siberia during October influences these high and low pressure systems. And early snow in that Siberia region equals a greater likelihood of a polar vortex disruption. So what is a polar vortex disruption and why does it matter? People talk about the polar vortex all the time. The polar vortex is actually when there's a strong jet stream, that model on the left there, and cold air is actually contained in the north. So this is where the media got it wrong. When they say there's a strong polar vortex, what they mean is there's a strong polar vortex disruption. What happens with blocking with highs and low pressure systems is that it can cause a wavy jet stream and allow cold air to move to the south. So that's under a polar vortex disruption. And here we see how that kind of happens. In North America, on the bottom left, we look at this. When you get these high pressure systems on either side of North America, which are warm air over the oceans and cold air over the poles, you can get this very wavy jet stream. And again, that Siberian snow in October, as well as the open Kara and Barents Sea, help create a blocking system, which creates these very wavy high and low pressure systems and really pretty much forces air to be pushed over the mid-continent of North America and into eastern North America. I also look at the El Nino forecast or the ENSO forecast. These have been relatively quality predictions through time for temperature, not as much so sometimes um, for precipitation. But they do have their limitations, and I look at them as a generalization, but then really work through a lot of um, long-term data to determine what the coming year will look like. One of the things I look at is the actual index numbers of historical El Nino and La Nina episodes. And if we look at 2020 and 2016, right now, 2020, we know from how the ocean, the Pacific Ocean is acting around the equator, that we are going to be entering a La Nina year. A lot of what has happened globally looks very, very much like 2016, active in the active hurricane season as well. So there's a lot of things that I've pulled from this to make my prediction, and it falls in line with some other long-term climatologists right now that are thinking that we're kind of set up to have a year that looks a lot like 2016. So leaving an El Nino year, went into the neutral, which is the gray, and we're going to be entering a La Nina year at this time. La Nina itself really doesn't predict everything for me. So what are my 2021 predictions for Eastern North America? The globe is so warm right now that it's going to take a long time to cool off, and no matter what the climate systems are doing. Our Octobers and Novembers have been increasingly warmer, and my expectation is that will continue. We've had a lot of active hurricanes. We still have tropical storms coming into the Gulf, and my expectation is that we'll have above average rainfall for the Northeast U.S. In mid-October and November. It's been very dry in the Northeast U.S. right now. But that's really likely that a large rainfall event or several reasonable rainfall events are going to occur in mid-October. There's one system coming in now that looks like it might do that. My expectation is there may be one or two more of those, especially if we stay relatively warm and those tracks of those storms start to move more into the Great Lakes region. We should probably see cold and warm air collide at a point that produces 3, 4, and 5-inch rains. This is very similar to what happened in 2016. The Southeast U.S. is already very, very wet. I don't expect that to go away. So think about how wet the landscape is and how that may affect duck migration too, and in your hunting. December is likely to be drier and have several reasonable cold fronts. They're likely going to be enough to move a good number of ducks south. So I'd say this is not really a push for watching this YouTube channel, but it's going to be really important because the timing of these are going to be really your best days to hunt is right after those cold fronts when those birds will be moving down, and especially if it's matched up with a bunch of snow. The bad news is January looks like it gets really mild with a lot of days in the 50-degree Fahrenheit range at northern U.S. latitudes, largely in the northeast U.S. It might temper down to the 40s as you get towards the Midwest, right? But those still aren't temperatures that make ducks move out. So a lot of those ducks into those December cold fronts will probably have moved. Mallards and black ducks will probably have stayed north, but a lot of the early dabbling ducks may be down south in that January period. But those ducks would have arrived a long time ago, and I think folks know how they get stale. And depending upon where the rainfall occurs throughout this time of year, there's also potential for a reverse migration. Now, again, these are very long-term predictions, but given the patterns I'm seeing globally and similarities to 2016, this is about as close as we can get to a reasonable forecast for duck migration at this point. But I think it's going to be really important to watch what happens in December and hunt those several cold fronts that may occur to probably get a bunch of your better hunts out of the year. We do not include local flooding in our predictions, so I say watch the river gauges. Here we see the daily stream flow conditions. The dark blues and the blues are where we're having greater than normal flows, and the oranges and reds are where we're seeing drier than normal conditions. So we see the northeast U.S. is relatively dry. If we get wet, we'll hold and warm, we'll hold ducks, which I think is actually going to happen through October in November. But when it does get cold, one of the problems with the southeast and even sections in the Mississippi flyway, and I think the potential tropical systems that are going to come up through the Mississippi Valley are going to make a lot of this blue to dark blue. I think we're going to see a relatively good amount of water on the landscape. This makes it much harder to find birds because they can spread out. And at northern latitudes, when there's flooding, sometimes we get ice on our wetlands, sometimes we get snow, but when rivers flood, it can hold specifically a lot of mallards and black ducks relatively far north. So as I do my forecast, I will also be talking about river gauges. I feel like it's an anomaly that we have not adequately, or I have not adequately included into these migration forecasts in the past. So thanks for listening. Please email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'm going to be doing these migration forecasts from October 2020 to January 2021 this year. Our first one will be next Sunday, episode 2. And then they will continue weekly until the end of January.